Welcome to Travel Stories with your hosts, Trevor Mountcastle and Tom Kim. This week, we're talking with Brandr, who is a personal friend and a fellow av geek, a commercial pilot, a Navy Reservist, and gosh, you probably have a couple other really amazing titles as well. How are you today?
I'm doing well. It's just a privilege to join both of you, Tom and Trevor. I've been a big fan of your podcast. We've known each other for 6 or 7 years now, so it's really just an honor to be on with you.
The honor is ours.
It's such a pleasure. I mean, it's been actually a couple of years, I think, since we've had a really decent conversation. So it's wonderful that we get to do it on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a fun one for us as well, because we went out to the Milenomics community on the Patreon side, and we actually had the opportunity to ask to solicit questions for you. Hopefully we'll get to a bunch of them, but we had a lot of interest just in your perspective. And I think that's a pretty cool experience.
Expect to be peppered with lots of questions.
So before we jump into that, could you share a little bit more of your background and just sort of what you'd like the audience to sort of understand as a baseline as we kind of walk through some of these questions and some of your travel stories?
Sure, absolutely. So I am one of you is kind of how I look at this. I started off, and I still very much am a points and miles nerd. I still love a great premium cabin redemption. I love a great 5-star, hotel redemption. And, I have a job as a pilot, but I'm still very much in the points and miles community. I started out about 20 years doing mileage runs and credit card churning and everything when I was in college. And, that continues to this day. So even though I do fly full time for both the Navy and the airlines, I'm still very much involved and very much interested in points and miles, which is kind of interesting because a lot of the pilots I fly with look at me like I'm crazy, just like the rest of us in this community, even though I'm flying the plane. But I went to the Naval Academy while I was in college. I was doing mileage runs on the 1 or 2 weekends we were allowed away, every semester, and redeeming those miles every summer for a nice trip. Wound up not expecting to be a pilot, honestly. I had a private pilot license, but I really wanted to be a submariner when I went to the Naval Academy. And over the summertime, we get to do different cruises, not a Tom Kim kind of cruise, but a Navy cruise. And I very quickly found out that the submarine community is probably not for me, having done a submarine cruise. So I kind of reassessed. Flying seemed to make a lot of sense. I already knew how to do it. I loved it. So luckily I was able to select naval aviation out of the academy. Went to Georgetown for a quick master's degree in security policy, and then I was off to Pensacola to Navy aviation training at the cradle of Navy aviation. Ended up selecting to fly the EP-3, which is not a very well-known plane in the Navy, but it's a signals reconnaissance aircraft. So I did that for a number of years out of Washington State. Flew mainly reconnaissance missions in the Western Pacific, but also about 500 hours of combat flight time over Afghanistan and Iraq. After a few years of doing that, I transitioned to some staff work in Washington, D.C., which was really a great opportunity to take the political science background that I always had an interest in my master's degree, and initially worked at an organization that was in charge of all the foreign military sales or the weapon sales for the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard to our partners overseas. So got to travel the world doing that.
Is that the Navy International Program Office, NIPO?
It is, absolutely. It's NIPO down in the Navy Yard. So did that for a number of years and then was selected to work for the Secretary of the Navy organizing his international travel. So got to fly around the world with him for a couple of years as well. After that time, I decided that I wanted to transition back to flying, which is something I really missed. So was able to transition to the Navy Reserves. Got to fly the C-130 first out of Andrews Air Force Base, Joint Base Andrews, and then up to McGuire, Joint Base McGuire. Around the same time, I was fortunate enough to get hired by a couple of legacy airlines and wound up at my current airline where I'm flying the 757 and 767, and I've been there for almost 5 years now. On the reserve side, I was very fortunate to get selected for Aviation Command. To me, the pinnacle of a naval aviator's career is getting to command a squadron, and I'm very lucky to be able to do that as a reservist. So I helped to run a squadron, a C-130 cargo squadron down in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I liken it to it's essentially running a small cargo airline. We've got 4 aircraft, couple hundred personnel between the maintainers, the operators, the pilots, the flight engineers, the load masters, the administrative personnel, and 4 planes that are flying, 24/7 around the world to meet short notice Navy logistics, air logistics requirements. So I do that. That's one of my jobs. And then I still fly for the airlines out of Washington, D.C. as well.
That's incredible. And for our listeners, this is actually really informative, I think, for Tom and I, because we don't really talk too much about your Navy side. So kind of understanding the progression of your career and everything I always find that interesting. Maybe it's just, the geek in me, but that's quite the progression.
Yep. Call me impressed.
Yeah, exactly. Command is always one of those, just as you said, the pinnacle of a career. If I could circle back to the craziness part, the mile and point side, obviously, you're flying a whole lot. You're staying in hotels. Those hotels are being paid, for the majority, I would imagine, by the airline. Do you get any sort of status recognition? Do you get any sort of points? Is there a benefit there, or is that more of kind of like a downside?
It's interesting. It's about 50-50. So I actually bid some of my airline trips specifically around the layover hotels that give us points and give us stay credit. So I'm probably one of the few people who does it, but again, it's part of the being the points and miles geek in the airline world. So I know exactly which hotels actually give us the credit, and some of them treat us very well, just like we're paying, customer. Others, because the airline is paying a very, very discounted rate, have no desire to recognize our hotel status.
Now, is that unique to particular hotel chains, or is it fairly unique or fairly divided? Not chain specific, but unique hotel specific?
It seems to be up to the individual property. We stay at a lot of different Bonvoy properties, whether they're Marriott's or Westins or Sheraton's. And it really depends on the individual property, whether they're going to honor, either the stay credit or provide us with other benefits.
That's interesting. It probably just goes to each individual properties, kind of way that they have a little bit of independence in the way that they market and the way they operate their hotels, despite the fact that they're part of this huge, gigantic chain.
Yeah, and we have some great long-lasting relationships with some of these hotels that, for example, there was one Sheraton Europe I was staying at. We've stayed there for 40 years, the same hotel as a company. So they had a big 40-year anniversary and invited everybody, all the crew members who were staying, to participate in that. And I thought that was pretty neat. They're also one of the hotels that, treats us pretty good and does above and beyond what they have to do.
That's incredible. So you sort of implied this, but let's talk a little bit more. So you plan the flights that you bid on a monthly basis, I think you mentioned. And you said that you plan in some cases based on the hotels that'll give you the status. What other factors do you play in? Obviously, if you're flying 767s and 757s, you're limited to those routes. But I have to imagine that if you're flying international a fair bit, you're fairly senior, so you've got a little bit more latitude in sort of what you can bid. And actually, I don't know what the term is for winning what you bid. But, sort of, walk us through a little bit of that approach, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I like about my fleet is there's incredible diversity of flying between the 757 and 767 flying. There's a decent amount of domestic trips, and then there's some European trips, South American trips, and Hawaiian trips. So there's usually something for everything, which means my seniority tends to go a little bit further than it might go on a more senior, a 777 or 78 fleet, where there's just not that much trip diversity. Kind of big picture, pilots chase different things. So there are plenty of pilots who just chase money, and they want to fly the biggest planes, which tend to earn the most amount of money. Interestingly, with my fleet, the 757 and 767, we have 3 different pay rates depending on which aircraft we're flying. So some pilots are going to chase flying a 767-400 simply because that pays just as much as a 777 or 78 would pay, whereas the 75 really pays closer to what a 737 would pay. Other pilots like efficiency. They want to work the most amount in the least amount of time. They'll pack their trips up so that they can, do 2 trips back to back. And like I said, all they care is about efficiency. And then the third group, which is kind of where I fall under, is quality of life. For me, I do enough work with the Navy that when I'm flying for the airline, I just want to enjoy my life. I'm not trying to fly as much as I possibly can. And that's where the layover hotels, layover destinations come in. There are a couple of cities in Europe I like very much. So I tend to bid those cities more. I love Switzerland. So that's kind of my standing bid. I'll take a Geneva or Zurich any day. I love to go hiking. I love the outdoors. So to me, that's kind of why I like those particular trips in addition to the hotels and the benefits.
Yeah, it's nice not to have to pay for a hotel in Switzerland.
It is,
Oh
yes.
yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah, so I could definitely understand that. I had a question, so what does a typical international trip look like for you? Just kind of curious.
Yeah, for me, I generally fly about a trip to Europe every single week. I'll do usually about 4 trips a month. The Europe trips are typically either 3 or 4 day trips. Again, I more about quality of life. The 4 day trips pay a little bit more, but they're not that efficient. So a lot of people don't like the 4 day trips, but for me, I'd much prefer a longer layover, especially in a nice, hotel in Europe. So I will try to bid the 4 day trips when they're available. And if not, it's the standard 3 day trip. But we typically, we leave the East Coast in the evening time. So depending on what position I'm in, because I can either bid the flying position or I can bid the relief pilot position, that kind of determines my nap schedule the day we depart. We get to the airport about 90 minutes beforehand to brief. We call dispatch. We look over all the flight paperwork. We look over all the maintenance documents on the aircraft, and we aim to get to the gate about an hour before departure to complete all our pre-flight obligations. Hopefully, we depart on time. Generally, flying over to Europe's pretty easy for me on the body. It's not really a red eye because we leave at 5 or 6 p.m. You're landing, it's only 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. body clock. So I find it physically not as bad as doing, for example, a South America trip where it's 10 hours overnight both ways. We get into Europe in the morning time. If it's a 3 day trip, we typically have a 26, 27 hour layover. So we're picked up either at the plane or we go through customs with the passengers at the airport and picked up at the curb. We get to our hotel, and then it's kind of up to each pilot what they want to do. I generally don't nap more than an hour or two. I try to just acclimate myself to European time and try to be active throughout the day so that I can naturally be more tired in the evening. We typically have dinner together. It's not a requirement, but generally we have the same kind of restaurants that we like. So I'll make a dinner reservation most places. If the other pilots want to join, that's great. And then the next day we get picked up again about 90 minutes before departure, get to the airport, go through all of our same procedures, talking to dispatch, reviewing the flight documents, and then depart Europe. And we're back on the East Coast, usually in the afternoon to early evening time frame.
Nice. Sounds interesting.
My gosh, I love how succinctly you just described all that. I mean, you could have literally been telling us the flight path you were going to take. It's interesting that you guys, in some cases, get picked up right at the plane versus having to go through customs, the normal way. Is that unique to particular destinations, or is that anything in particular that you can share?
It just depends on the airport, different procedures depending on which airport you're at. Most of the time, we go through the terminal, we clear customs there. But certain locations, London, for example, will get picked up plane side and get driven, right to the hotel from the tarmac.
So, Trevor mentioned flight plans. How often does that get affected by weather or turbulence?
Quite a bit. For example, last week I did 2 back-to-back Geneva trips. So I did a 4 day Geneva trip, immediately followed by a 3 day Geneva trip. So it's kind of interesting. The exact same flights, only spaced out a couple of days apart. And we were on completely different routings just
Oh,
because of the forecast turbulence. Just the jet stream is constantly shifting. So it really varies day to day to day on which tracks they're using. And for example, the North Atlantic track system, we have these tracks that aren't necessarily defined by specific set latitude and longitudes, but they vary every single day. New tracks will be published. So even going the same destination one day to the next day, the tracks are going to be completely different depending on the weather.
That's an interesting observation too. Perhaps not something that you've flown as a pilot, but as a passenger, I know that I've flown a couple of times on that Etihad flight from Dulles to Abu Dhabi. And in some cases, it feels like you get up to New York, you hang a hard right, and instead of that great circle approach, you're going like straight across. You go over Iberia, you fly over the Med, hang a hard right over Egypt, kind of a hard left to scoot over to Abu Dhabi. And I guess in my head, I always thought that was, more a factor of tailwind. But are there other things that kind of factor into that?
Yeah, there are quite a bit of things that could factor into it. In addition to the winds, forecast turbulence, there could be either space weather, solar weather or even ozone issues that could impact that, plus volcanoes, all sorts
Oh,
of
yeah.
different things.
The Icelandic volcano that none of us can actually describe
Yep.
or say. So
I keep hoping that that thing will go off while I'm in Europe because that could be very advantageous. But
that sounds like that could be fun. Sort of, teasing that out a little bit more. Does turbulence ever phase you from a pilot's perspective, or also, being in the back of the plane, or hopefully not too far back in the plane as a passenger?
from a pilot perspective, no. I mean, I have confidence in the structure of the plane that I'm not worried that anything structurally is going to happen with turbulence. I'll tell you, my time in the Navy, sometimes having to fly high priority missions, I've gone through some pretty horrendous weather, typhoons, hurricanes that we just have to go through. And I have confidence in the aircraft. What does phase me with turbulence is just the potential for injury, especially with our flight attendants. I would like to get through a whole career without ever having a flight attendant seriously injured due to turbulence, but every single year we have flight attendants who are injured. So I try to make the seatbelt sign mean something, because if the sign is on for 3 hours, it becomes meaningless. But at the same time, I do want to try to avoid passenger and flight attendant injuries. So one, technique that I do, I always hack the clock and start a stopwatch as soon as the seatbelt sign comes on, just to remind me that at some point I need to reassess and we can discuss, about turning it off. I will say that the technology we have now has also gotten, even in the last 4 or 5 years that I've been an airline pilot, significantly better when it comes to predictive turbulence. We have an app now that we have on all of our iPads that communicates with all the other iPads on all the other pilot, iPads on different aircraft. And it's incredible how accurate it can be to forecast turbulence down to, we get a notification 2 minutes from now, you're going to have turbulence. And more times than not, 2 minutes from now, we have turbulence. So my goal is just to try to keep the rest of the crew and the passengers safe, and hopefully have the seatbelt sign mean something. But I don't fear turbulence is going to damage the aircraft, if that makes sense.
That's really reassuring, that the technology has kind of improved. I guess it's probably a function of connectivity and kind of app ubiquity instead of maybe AI or forecasting, right? It just sounds like it's just because it's nice to have all those different data points, from all those planes that are flying in front of you, right?
Yeah, it's really an ingenious solution. They're able to monitor the movement of all these individual iPads, hundreds of them over the North Atlantic, and they can all communicate and kind of come up with a picture that's pretty accurate, much better than weather forecasting.
It's interesting because I remember back when, was it Channel 9 or Channel 13 used to be an option on United. Used to fly them pretty frequently. And it was always interesting listening to that because you'd hear the different pilots radioing air traffic control and asking, how's the ride at this many feet or this many thousand feet? Or hearing air traffic control sort of say, hey, I'm hearing that it calms down in another 10 minutes or something to that effect. And to hear that technology has evolved in such an automated way is pretty cool.
It's reassuring as a passenger, to hear that there's that kind of innovation happening, and that ultimately, I know it's also a safety thing for the staff, but, it's a comfort for the passengers too.
Yeah. And that idea of the stopwatch, I don't know that I get the feeling that most pilots do that.
It can be frustrating. I was flying, I won't say what airline, but out of Korea 2 weeks ago, and the seatbelt sign was on for 3 hours.
Yikes.
We were well past Japan before the sign was ever turned off, flying to the US. And it's just meaningless at that point. I mean, people are going to disregard it, and it increases injury. So, I'm fortunate that a lot of the captains I fly with, they feel the same way. Make the sign mean something. Don't leave it on forever just to, try to cover yourself if something happens, because it's self-defeating.
I think you've got a kind of a unique experience because, you've got, kind of that both sides of the fence kind of perspective, seeing as how you were, such a big miles and points nerd and AV geek. And obviously now you're a pilot as well. I was just curious, has, your knowledge that you now have as a pilot, has that informed your travel style? Has it changed somewhat since you've gotten into commercial aviation?
I think there's some aspects that it certainly has. I'm able to recover from jet lag a little bit easier. I think I plan out, even when I'm traveling as a passenger for long haul flights on awards and such. I plan, my sleep schedule much like I would if I was operating the flight. So I feel I'm just better rested when I get to the destination.
So I want to try to pivot a little bit. We'll continue to kind of pivot back and forth from the commercial side to the military side. Obviously, we know that I think active duty, I don't know if reservists get the annual fees waived on credit cards, but what are some of the things that as a reservist you leverage from a miles and points perspective that perhaps other reservists or active duty listeners might be able to learn from?
Sure. Well, SCRA, the Service Members Civil Relief Act, still applies to reservists just as much as it does to active duty. The catch is that you need to be on orders for 30 days or more. So, as a reservist, there's at least one set of 30-day orders that I'm taking every single year. And during that time, I rehack my SCRA benefits with, all the credit card agencies and let them know that I'm back on orders. And generally, then that satisfies it for the following year. As far as other items that I leverage, I'm fortunate enough to be senior enough in my squadron that I can kind of pick the trips that I want to fly for the Navy. So generally, I like to go to the Western Pacific. Those also tend to be the trips that have the highest government contract airfares. So
Ah,
generally, I can make 1K on United just by booking the contract fares that I know are going to be more expensive to the destinations that I want to go fly from. So I pretty much only will pick trips to Tokyo, trips to Guam for the Navy, and we have frequently, every month we've got a couple of those. So those are the trips that I tend to target with the Navy to help just the status that I'm able to earn.
have you ever flown the Island Hopper?
I have not flown the Island Hopper on United. That's a bucket list item still because I'm a complete flight nerd still, and I have my flight memory map, and it just would look so much better if it was filled in with the Island Hopper. But that being said, I've pretty much flown to every single one of those islands on the C-130. It's kind of fascinating how nothing has changed in 50 years of naval aviation when it comes to how we operate the C-130 in the Pacific. We still have to hop from island to island to island, just like we did in the 40s and the 50s. So, for example, I've got a trip next week leaving Honolulu, so I'm going to fly to Honolulu, pick up a C-130 in Honolulu. We're going to hop to Majuro, then we're going to hop to Guam, and then on the way back, we're going to go to Wake Island. Then we're going to go back to Hawaii. So nothing has really changed. So I've done my own version of the Island Hopper, but I would still really like to fly the actual Island Hopper at some point.
Definitely on my bucket list too. I haven't made it quite there yet. Have made it to Guam, but none of those other islands really, other than maybe Hawaii.
That makes three of us that haven't done the island hopper. We
We
might
could do
need
it
to try
together.
to. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that would be fun.
Let's make a date.
There we go. So as we're sort of, hopping about different topics, you mentioned that you had your private pilot's license, I suppose, before you got into the academy or while you're in the academy. What is your experience kind of talking with other commercial pilots as far as kind of how they made it to become a commercial pilot? Just because it seems to me like growing up, I think we all knew the majority, or at least the majority of pilots I knew growing up, I should say. My parents had tons of friends. In fact, we had a close family friend who would literally change and bid his flights when we would go to Bermuda. So he would be, flying our flights. Most of them were, either Air Force or naval aviators, retired, of course. It seems like there's more folks that are kind of coming at it without doing that military service prior. What's your perspective on how those folks sort of attain to the main line? Obviously, knowing that there's that interim regional step that seems to sort of help them get greater flight hours. And if I'm getting any of this stuff wrong, please correct me.
No, you're pretty much spot on. Traditionally, there have been two ways to get to a major carrier, whether it's a legacy carrier like American, Delta, United, or a carrier like FedEx or UPS. There's either the military track, where you do a full military commitment, which is for pilots now 10 plus years, or there's the civilian route where you start off, getting your pilot's licenses. You usually do some flight instructing, then you wind up at a regional airline for 5, 10 years, and then you get on with a major airline. But things are changing rapidly just due to the need for pilots now. It's incredible that, legacy carriers are hiring 2,000 plus pilots a year. We've really never seen that before. So I would say the military is still very much a viable way to get to the legacy airlines, but it's certainly not going to be the quickest. And I would also say if military service is not something that you feel deeply called to, it's probably not the best way. There are quicker ways to do it, and it's a significant commitment and significant sacrifice to be a military pilot. So if you're just looking for the quickest on-ramp to get to large airline, military might not be the best way to do that. But what I will say is the military flight training is fantastic. The product that even the Air Force, but the product the Navy or the Air Force provides and produces is really incredible. The experience that you get over a short amount of time, it's really hard to compare that to anything else that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how the market forces have kind of changed those pathways a little bit, right? I mean, I think there's just such that overwhelming need now to kind of staff up these airlines, and I guess the non-military pathways have just, I guess, just grown quite a bit just to match what the market demands, I guess.
It's incredible. Yeah, I was in my mid 30s when I got hired by the two legacy airlines that I got hired by, but now we have young pilots in their early 20s who are coming on to United, coming on to Delta, coming on to American at just such an incredible age. And to think of the longevity they're going to have, 40 plus years,
Wow,
it's
yeah.
almost impossible to fathom that.
That's probably something that's a sign of these times, not what you'd seen in past ages, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, obviously they're also coming from a completely different background. Oh, well, maybe not completely, but a meaningfully different background, right? Your experience flying combat operations in the sandbox is probably something that informed how you fly through bad weather or bad turbulence, I would imagine, that they might have attained similar experience just going through that, those crazy winds or other sort of things. Not to say that they have any less experience, just they come to it from a little bit different background of experience.
They do. It's just different experience. I'll tell you, as a military pilot, when I first got to the airlines, I was kind of lost at how we get to a gate. How do we get off a gate? To me, Chicago O'Hare, the first couple of times I operated out of that, my head was on fire because to me, it's just mass organized chaos. And to a regional pilot who's probably done that for 10 years, it was completely normal.
That's a really interesting experience because I'd imagine that, military bases, it's probably much, much, much cleaner, much clearer. You're not dealing with waiting on the jetway operator or somebody to push you back, perhaps.
Exactly.
So just kind of a fun question. And I say this is another question that we got from our listeners, but I include it because I think there's a bunch of random conversation about it, for lack of a better way of saying it, with this whole UFO thing. I don't know. It seems like it gets in the news every few years. Do you see, obviously you've probably seen the Northern Lights more beautiful than any of us. I had the chance to see them on an Emirates flight, and it was something that I will never forget. But do you see any other kind of weird things that make you think that, something funky is going on?
I've never seen anything that made me think, well, that's a UFO. I have seen some things that I could imagine other people could interpret as being otherworldly. One thing that comes to mind, the Starlink satellite constellations.
Oh, yeah.
Depending on the lighting and the inclination, and especially how long they've been in orbit, because they tend to separate over time. But if they're really close together, it looks incredible. It looks like something out of this world when you see it initially. But then once you kind of know what it is, it makes sense.
Gotta love those low Earth orbiting satellites.
Yep. Shooting stars, I see those all the time. The Northern Lights, sometimes they can just be so bright, so dynamic. You can literally see them move as you're flying. It's really quite a sight.
Having had the opportunity, because of amazing pilots, to have occasionally sat in the cockpit and just sort of envisioning how that looks when you're up in the air. Obviously, I've only been on the ground. I just have to believe that you get to see things that very few people get the opportunity to witness.
And that's still one of my favorite things about flying, just the sunset views, the sunrise, when you get to see the moonrise over the ocean, and it just so massive as it comes up over the horizon. It's just the things you get to see are incredible.
So as we kind of go down that path, obviously you've talked about the most amazing things of being a pilot, and I think that's just absolutely awesome. Anything that's your least favorite? And is it different? Would your answer be different when speaking from a naval aviator perspective or commercial pilot perspective?
Yeah, I think it would be different. The Navy has different challenges than what I face in the commercial airlines. For me, the C-130, for example, it's known to break quite a lot. It's known to have a lot of malfunctions. There's a good chance I'll go my entire airline career without having an engine failure in flight. I probably average an engine failure every year, flying a C-130. So I'm fortunate that the Navy training that I've received has really prepared me well, but it can be a challenge just doing the maintenance aspect and the sometimes the unreliability The parts system is not the best, just getting resupplied. It's not uncommon to be broken for a week somewhere, where that wouldn't happen at the airlines. You would be fixed pretty quickly if you broke. But as far as the airline side, the least favorite thing, I just have to say some of the inefficient aerospace infrastructure we have in this country can be challenging at times, whether it's at Dulles, the immigration arrival facilities there at those terminals that should have been torn down years ago, decades ago. The temporary, almost like trailers that are still substituting for terminals. At Newark, for example, that airline doesn't function if there's a cloud, within 50 miles of it. Just some of the very inefficient ways our transportation infrastructure exists in the U.S. that I don't find elsewhere. I was thinking last year, I remember I was in Tokyo flying up to Hokkaido, Sapporo, and it was the outskirts of this typhoon was, approaching Tokyo, and it was Haneda. It was 6 p.m. in the evening. It was kind of rush hour, all these planes getting off, and we had 45, 50 knot winds, and the airport was functioning like nothing was happening. I mean, every third plane was going around, but they were still launching planes every 60 seconds. It was beautiful. It was just a piece of beauty. And I just can't imagine anything like that happening in Newark or Washington or really any airport in the U.S. The whole place would just be shut down for hours.
Yeah, it's amazing how little it takes to bring our infrastructure or, the overall machine to its knees.
Is the FAA still the biggest consumer of vacuum tubes?
I don't know if any of us will know that one.
Maybe they still have some IBM XTs, sitting in the warehouse. They they got those stockpiled pretty well, I heard. Anyway.
Most often it's my jokes that fall
I know.
flat,
what's going on?
This one is beyond my depth.
I guess so. We heard about kind of the negative things. I mean, is kind of the best perks of flying, is it the non-rev? Like, what's your favorite perk of your two different roles there as a pilot?
Well, for me, I get to do what I love. I love flying the C-130. I love flying the 767. I just love flying in general. The fact that I get paid to do something that almost seems like a hobby. I mean, it doesn't seem like a job when I'm actually flying. All the other administrative stuff, that's kind of work. But, that's what I like. The fact that I get to travel. I've been blessed to go to 105 different countries, mostly on, the Navy's dime. The fact that I get to fly a fleet that goes all over Europe. I try every single year to fly to every single European destination that my fleet flies to, which is quite a number of countries. So just the fact that I get to do that, it's still amazing 5 years into it on the airline side and 18 years into it on the Navy side that I get to do what I do.
So can I sneak in here and just ask, you've noted that you're a 1K. You've noted that, and I don't know if you mentioned other status as well. I know as someone with similar restrictions when I have to travel for work, sometimes you have to really play to be able to get the airline that you want. So I imagine that you might have other status on other airlines. When you try to fly, or do you fly non-rev? And if you do, does that status impact your, I'll say, experience? Maybe not your seniority in being able to make the particular flight. And then number two, do you find that because you've got that status and because you're in the miles and points game, that you use that non-rev ability with the same frequency as somebody who might not be playing the miles and points game?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There are a couple of different aspects to it. So I've got 1K status with United. I've been executive platinum for, I think, 19 straight years now with American. I've got platinum status on Delta. I don't know how long that will last. So I'm lucky to have all those statuses. But when you non-rev and you're strictly non-revving, the status is pretty much meaningless. It doesn't get you any benefit whatsoever, regardless of which airline. The nice thing, though, is that both the legacy carriers that I've worked for, they have discount tickets that employees can use that do give you all the benefits of having the status, do let you earn, miles and spend towards earning more status. So I do that a lot, and sometimes they can be very advantageous because they don't have advanced purchase requirements necessarily. The fares are quite reasonable, especially for premium cabin international. And I will say that I love a great premium cabin redemption. I love flying ANA. I love flying JAL. So I still do a lot of that, but having the non-rev option to fall back on if I can't find the last minute award space is really kind of nice.
Did I hear you correctly that you can actually get a discounted premium space as well?
Yeah.
Rather than hoping that status or non-rev gets you into a premium cabin, you actually can get a discounted employee business class or first class fare?
You can, absolutely. And it counts towards, earning status as well, just like a regular paid ticket. It's essentially just a paid ticket at a certain amount of discount.
Where do I
Wow.
sign up?
You got to start from the bottom, Trevor. You got to start with a regional carrier, I think.
Oh, drat. I'm too old for that.
Speaking of regional carriers, there's one up in the Northwest that seems to have a lot of craziness going on lately. This is our friend Horizon, partner of Alaska Airlines. I guess in the past year or two, they've had quite a few incidents of interestingness, haven't they?
They have, especially recently. They were in the news for not a great reason. And I know it's caused a lot of concern amongst the general public about what's going on inside the flight deck and jump seating, and is that really safe and sustainable?
It just sounds like such a weird situation. I mean, it's kind of funny. Like, we've just been having so many of these very, very strange, isolated things that probably don't happen, but once a decade or 2 decades or whatever. But they seem to be happening more frequently lately. Wonder what's going on. Is there something in the water?
No, I think pilots are human, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what I think we really need to do is get serious about pilot mental health. You look at all the required disclosures. Any sort of medical appointment that I have ultimately has to be disclosed when I do my annual medical flight physical. And what could even be just a mild anxiety or depression, something that somebody is trying to responsibly treat at a very low level through with mental health professionals, could result in them being grounded for months or years until the FAA can adjudicate their case and determine that they're fit to fly. So unfortunately, that really prevents pilots from disclosing things. And it's not just mental health. There was a survey recently that showed that 56% of pilots had declined medical treatment just for fear of having to deal with the FAA and fear of losing their source of livelihood for months or years. And, we need to change that.
I would agree. I think that has a lot of unintended consequences.
It does. And I look at what we do in the military. I've got sailors who work for me right now. And if they disclose they have a mental health issue, we're going to get them the care that they need. We're not going to prevent them from working on a plane for years while it, adjudicates itself through this giant bureaucracy.
That's one of the many things where the military actually does it better than we do on the commercial side. It sounds like.
Credit, to the service, leading the way,
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's still room for growth. I mean, there's a new act called the Brandr Act, which unfortunately, a sailor had to commit suicide in order to have this act be named after him. But ultimately, if I've got a service member who needs mental health, I'm going to see to it that they get that health. And because of that, there's less fear of reprisal. There's less fear that they're going to get in trouble for just trying to get the help that they should get.
And hopefully less stigma as well.
Exactly.
So, the main line of Horizon, Alaska, they have another amazing route, don't they? The Alaska Milk Run. Have you been able to do that one at all?
I have not, but I have done portions of that. I used to fly P3s, EP3s out of Whidbey Island, which is all the way north in the Pacific Northwest. So sometimes we'd be lucky enough to be able to go take a trainer flight and go up to Alaska and bounce in some of the fields like Ketchikan and Juneau and other places I believe that milk run goes to. And then I remember I was on a layover once in Anchorage. It was a Navy layover. It was like a 2-day layover. And at this time, I don't know what it is now, but I think you could get intra-Alaska award ticket for like 5,000 miles. It was something ridiculously cheap. So I went all the way up. Went up to Prudhoe Bay, went over to Barrow, had a long layover in Barrow, got to do a tour there, and then flew back to Anchorage. So it was like an awesome day of just hopping around Alaska that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I don't think I've done the actual milk run, but I've done Juneau. What did I do? Juneau, Sitka, Ketchikan, Anchorage, I think. So some of it.
Yeah, I think the best I've gotten up to was Anchorage. And to be honest with you, that's probably a little, I'm more the islands guy. I'm not really the snow and, Alaska guy. I'm probably going to do it at some point in my life, just from an AvGeek standpoint. I almost wonder, and I'm putting you guys both on the spot here, are there other of those types of experiences? It's funny because we talk about the island hopper and the milk run on the boat side, because you know me, I have to bring in, the boats every so often. We used to have the bagel run, and we had a separate one. And this is back when I was running passenger ferries up and down Fire Island, that would actually go to each island, or each island community, I should say, and clear the old payphones. So you'd bring, a Bell, I think it was Bell Telecom or whatever Bell, baby Bell it was, a technician, and you'd stop at every beach. Are there any other of those? I know that's kind of a random data point, right? But are there any other of those sort of hopper type flights that you're aware of, whether it's in the US or overseas, that's on your list to be able to, kind of, add to your flight map?
Maybe none of those hopper flights, but there's still so many places I want to explore. The Pacific is just so big, and so many of these small little islands that I'd love to get to that I've not been able to while I've been in the Navy. So that's going to be something once I have a little bit more free time that I'm going to try to explore. Same thing, the Aleutian Islands. I've been lucky enough to fly a couple of trips, Navy trips up there. We have a great trip every year. We actually fly EOD teams to go blow up these riverways in Adak, Alaska that kind of get clogged with lumber and everything over the winter time. So I love flying up to Adak, and I've been to Shemia, which is just about as remote as you can possibly get in the U.S. So just getting to explore places like that, Kodiak, Alaska, is another place I really do enjoy. I think there's just beauty. One thing I find beautiful is just obscurity and remoteness. It doesn't have to be cold or warm necessarily. So those are some of the trips that I try to pick up now that I've only got a couple years left of flying in the Navy.
That's incredible. I mean, the variety of flying in the Navy, I mean, I don't think that we commonly think about some of those random things. I mean, like the EOD team in this remote place just to ensure that, I think you said a river flows freely. Do you do a lot of international kind of engagement? Do you get to some of those types of experiences overseas? I know you said you've been doing a fair bit of North Asia, but any kind of unique experiences, or I dare say travel stories that you could share from, international flying for the Navy?
One thing I love about the Navy C-130 is, well, the C-130 in general is such a versatile aircraft. The amount of cargo it can carry, its ability to land in relatively short fields with the amount of cargo it has is incredible. So that's something that the Navy uses, and we do a lot of community outreach that I don't think really gets the credit or isn't recognized as much as it should be. So every summer, I usually spend a month or two out in Japan. And while I'm out there, we're doing Navy missions all across Southeast Asia. Really, we're taking CB units that are going to go build a school somewhere, doing community outreach. So Papua New Guinea, for example, will fly into a relatively small field. We'll drop off a bunch of Navy CBs who are going to go construct a building for a community. We'll come back a week later, pick them up. Had a chance to go to a field in Vietnam I didn't even know existed this summer. And I think we were the first U.S. Navy C-130 that's been there in probably 30 years. And all the locals came out and were taking photos of us. Even the immigration people all wanted a photo with the plane. Parts of the Philippines, we fly to a lot of remote fields in the Philippines, which I love because it's challenging flying. It's something I don't get to do at the airline, but it's also very rewarding when you see what we're doing to help these smaller communities. So those are some experiences that, I think I'm going to look back on when I'm done flying the Navy as kind of the most rewarding things that I've gotten to do.
Oh man, that just sounds so fun, challenging, but the fact that you've done it, not only, is that a feather in your cap, but you did it for such a great reason and a great purpose.
Yeah, and I think just a lot of people lose sight of all the great community relations and all the great things, the Pacific partnerships that we have with so many nations that the Navy is doing really humanitarian work.
I mean, I guess part of the reason for that is, or one of the results of that is just, just how friendly, that part of the world is to the U.S. We have so many allies and partners out there. I mean, it's kind of interesting, how a lot of that, I think, is that outreach and that community outreach that you talked about, it really pays dividends, I think, in a way, and sort of the soft power of the United States, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not naive. There's a strategic reason why we're doing this. And
Of course.
just like you said, soft power. But, there's other countries that have significant influence or trying to influence these much smaller island nations, so that any chance that we have to do good is just a win, I think.
Yep. So, you talked about the C-130s. I'm curious, what are some of your favorite things about flying 757s versus 767s? It's interesting how they're both such, completely different aircraft. And yet, you have the rating on one, you have the rating on the other, right?
Yeah, they're completely different. And even Between the 767s that I fly, it's the 767-400. If you look at the history of how that was designed, I mean, it's
Hmm.
essentially a 777. The flight deck is a 777 flight deck. It was initially designed to be a common type rating with the 777, but Delta Airlines was able to influence that a little bit, influence Boeing, so it became a common type rating with the 767, so Delta didn't have to pay their pilots more. So it's kind of interesting how that plane evolved. But the main difference between the 757 and 67, the 57 is like a sports car. The plane is
That's what you
so
hear, right?
overpowered.
Yeah, yeah.
It's an incredible plane. I think it's next to the 747, probably the best plane Boeing's ever designed. What they should have done is just made a new composite 757, and that would have solved
What a
all of
shame they
the
didn't do
issues that
that.
we're seeing now. But you
Yeah.
just look at the performance, it's almost kind of like a C-130. Its short field performance is exceptional. The fact that you have a plane that can take off out of Bogota fully loaded, but can also do a transatlantic flight, admittedly not greatly, but just you look at how diverse the flying is on the 757 and how many different missions it can do. It's really incredible, and it's just a fun plane to fly. Flying a 7.6, it's kind of like driving a Cadillac. I mean, it's got all this hydraulic power. It's very smooth, but you get the feeling you're flying. You have to fly 7.5 quite a bit differently than the 7.6.
So you got the Corvette and you got the Caddy. I got
Yep.
it. It's kind of what I thought, but I'm glad you're confirming what I thought.
It's interesting because the 757 was my favorite to fly in United when I was a heavy United flyer. In fact, I think it was seat 7D. Was it seat 7D or 7E? That was just the best seat in economy. You're right by 2L. Well, I suppose 2R, I should say. And then, that aircraft in general had more business class seats too, which was kind of a benefit. And it's kind of a shame because, the 737-900 just doesn't, while it probably
It's not the same.
it probably takes almost comparable passengers. It's just not the same. And it's definitely far from the 757 experience.
Yeah, and you look at the 757-300, and it is just a beautiful plane. It is so long and so elegant. It
is.
I mean, they call it the flying pencil, but I really like how it looks.
Well, it's a testament to the longevity of the 757, right? I mean, there's so many of these 20-year-old 757s out there, with all the major airlines, except maybe what is an American, the one that has probably the least at this point. I know
They
Delta
retired all of their 7.5s. A lot of them got converted to cargo. Some are still sitting in the desert, but yeah, Americans stopped flying them.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure Delta is gonna, wring every single last bit of life out of theirs. Seems like United's doing the same, right?
Aren't they doing the same thing on the MD-80s? Or do they still have the?
I think
the 727s. No, it's the 727s that they got from AirTran.
You mean
right?
717?
717s. I'm sorry. Yes.
I think they've announced the retirement of the 717s actually on the Delta side. To just put our AV geek hats on here, I think for our listeners, so hopefully they aren't going to turn off right now. But
yeah, well, it's just interesting. Do they even have crew rest on 7.5s?
They don't, so they block off passenger seats to allow for crew rest, which isn't ideal.
Does that ever factor in for you? I mean, I have to believe probably not because you're flying 757s and 767s, but I guess I'm thinking like a 767, you're probably talking, to Brazil. You're not getting to Asia, are you?
No, generally for the 7.6s, it's going to be Europe, domestic, Hawaii, South America.
Yeah.
Is that a blocked off seat on the 7.6s as well? Because I think I've seen that on some 7.6s where they block off some business seats or something.
There is, yeah. There's a curtain around one of the seats that they use to block it off, and it's quite comfortable and quiet.
Oh, yeah. I think I've observed that on a couple of different aircraft. In fact, one time, I can't remember if we've shared this story on...
I think we did.
Because American was flying an A330 from Dublin to Philly. It was short enough that they didn't need to have the crew rest seat. And so I ended up sitting in that crew rest seat because I was a very last minute ad. They weren't kind enough to pull the curtain around for me, though. That probably would have been very, very nice.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the flights that we fly, depending on time of the year, will be augmented, meaning an additional pilot, or unaugmented, just two pilots. And again, the winter time with the heavier winds coming back from Europe, we have to add an additional pilot. But the same route in the summertime, we'll just go with two pilots. And a lot of the airline pilots hate that unaugmented overnight flying. For me, I actually like those very much because they tend to be shorter trips to Europe. Flying a C-130 normally is just 2 pilots. Will go on for, up to 18-hour crew days. So flying a 7.6 for 6 hours on augmented doesn't seem that arduous to me. And they tend to be longer layovers in that case. So I always pick up those trips, fortunately.
I think this whole discussion has been really amazing for me because I feel like we were able to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit, and see some of the things, especially, from that miles and points AV geek perspective. So I was just curious, do you have any kind of, with all this new information you have, do you have any interesting advice for kind of the miles and points nerds out there, now that you have some of the information that you have?
That's a great question. I think one thing I would recommend is just use your miles. I've gotten away from hoarding them. I see how all the programs just continually devalue. There's so much point inflation that just find a great redemption that works for you and do it. Don't wait for the perfect redemption because that might never come and you don't know how much your miles can be worth tomorrow or the next day.
I love that advice because, our podcast, Travel Stories, I just feel like that's, I think one of the things that we focus on a little bit more is, we're a lot about the redemption and not as much about the acquisition. Honestly, I think the redemption part is the fun part.
There Absolutely. You go. I think you just covered our mission statement. To burn our miles for meaningful travel and the stories that come from it.
It's true.
It is. So, Brandr, I just have to say thank you so much. This has been just an incredible episode, an incredible opportunity to have you on here. You are a friend of the podcast. You are welcome on any time that you would like to. We've talked so much about your professional side, and perhaps sometime in the future we could have you back on and talk about some of your amazing trips. I know that you're a big fan of the Maldives, for example, which I am now a fanboy of.
That's surprising. Trevor, Maldives fanboy is not something that I was thinking was going to happen on this podcast.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, I'm actually going in January. I've got Q suites booked. I'm super excited.
Oh, so jealous.
I think I kind of joke, but now that half the meals I eat seem to be business class meals, I get a little bit less excited about in-flight dining. But I'm still, whenever I have a Q suites booking, I'm pretty excited.
Occupational hazard of a pilot, huh? Not being as excited about business class meals. I guess that is one good or maybe bad occupational hazard.
But it's been an honor to be on the podcast. Like I said, I'm also a big listener, and it's just been awesome to see where this has gone over the last year or so.
Thank you so much. And yes, this has been exciting. And the opportunities to have folks like you on the podcast and share your story is perhaps the greatest benefit and the greatest honor for us. With that said, I think we'll call the show here. And thank you again, Brandr, for joining us. And also thank our listeners for joining us, as we hope you do every episode.
If you've enjoyed this episode, consider becoming a Milenomics Patreon member and get access to even more in-depth miles, points, and travel content.
Thanks, everybody.